I'm a therapist. I should know how to make myself feel happier, or I should know the things that I have to do in order to make my relationship with my husband more harmonious.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. My name is Reesa and I'm your host. We are talking to real families about real stories here on The Real Family Eats, where we've got food for thought and thoughtful food. So let's eat. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. I have my lovely guest today, Sarina. Hi, Sarina. Thanks so much for being on our show today.
Thanks for having me, Risa.
Yay. I'm so excited to hear your recipe and your story. We've got a really kind of, I think, pertinent topic for a lot of our families here. But before we do that, for anybody who doesn't know you, could you introduce yourself for us?
I will. Thanks again, everyone, for having me. Risa and I go way back. I am a marriage and family therapist. We were in the same cohort together at University of San Diego, so
Whoop, whoop. Go
alumni.
Toreros.
And I have my own private practice now, um, so that is what I do. I'm a therapist in private practice and specialize in Asian American issues, cultural identity, racial trauma, intergenerational trauma. So that's me, and that's what I do. I work part-time as a therapist and full-time as mom.
Awesome. So now's our shameless plug section. You were mentioning being a therapist. I'd love for you to share with our guests kind of, do you have a website? How can they find you if that resonates for them?
That's a great question. Right now, I just have my website. But hopefully in the future, we'll focus more on the branding aspect. But if you want to find me on my website, I am at sarinachantherapy.com. And my name is spelled Sarinachan. And that's me.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure to link that in the show notes for anybody who's also needing Sarina's lovely services and helpful services for a population that is super important and also near and dear to my heart as well. So, yay. Okay, so tell me today, what recipe are you sharing with us and why did you choose this one?
Okay. So full transparency. I am, and my husband will laugh when he sees this, I'm not the main chef in the house. My husband is amazing. So I needed to find a recipe that would be somewhat easy for me to share. This is my mom's fried rice recipe. So growing
Mm,
up, um, fried rice was a really it was a dish that I would look forward to, but it was also something that was easy for my mom to make because you can throw in leftovers. You got old rice, you got some molten veggies, and you need to use up. Fried rice is the way to kind of combine all of those things into a tasty meal. And I never knew that this was like her go-to easy meal, so it worked
okay.
out. And that's what Risa will be cooking for us today.
Awesome. Well, I'm super excited. I know my whole family loves fried rice, so they're excited about this. All right. So before we get started talking a little bit about the story you're going to share with us today, walk me through some of the first couple of steps of the recipe, and I'll get those things started while we chat.
Sounds good. So, um, like I was mentioning, you've got your ingredients
Hmm.
and you kind of throw them all together. So what we're starting
Okay.
with is we're gonna scramble some eggs.
Hmm.
The next part is we're gonna cook up our meat and our onions. And then the last step is kind of throwing in the rice and warming that up.
Okay.
And then by the end, we're just kind of combining your vegetables, your scrambled eggs, your meat all together, and you should have a nice dish by the end of it.
Okay. Perfect. Well, I'll get started. So I know one of the stories that you were willing to share with us, which again, I so appreciate because I think that your story is one, super powerful and also super relatable to a lot of folks who had kids or were pregnant kind of during our COVID quarantine and that whole kind of mess, if you will, and that it was made it likely a very different experience than some of the traditional stories that you might hear out there. So I'd love to kind of hear more about that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm so glad that I'm so appreciative for you and giving a platform to this story that I think so many parents have had experienced during the pandemic. But basically, my story begins in 2020 and January 2020. I was um, entering my third trimester. My due date was April 2020. And I
Oh my
think
goodness. So, right smack when everything shut down.
I think we all know how that went during that time. So, so I think my husband and I started to realize things were getting serious when our um like birthing classes and our like pre-parenting classes through the hospital were starting to get canceled. So
Okay.
we were kind of signed up to take all the like the little classes that they provided about like feeding, baby basics, all of that cool stuff. And then kind of like by February, March, right as things were starting to lock down and
Mhm.
get a bit more intense, that's when we got the notification like, okay, our classes are getting canceled because they're wanting to protect everyone. And then in the midst of all that, we were also closing on a house. So,
Oh,
third
wow.
trimester, all the things are getting canceled. Everyone's kind of sheltering in place. Um, we were trying to like finish our home buying process so that we could like get ready and get moved in. But at that time, like even the banks were closing because I think everyone was just so uncertain with what was going on that banks were shutting down and hospitals were like very limited. So it was a very interesting and uncertain time when a lot of our plans looked different than what we had expected. And then by the time um my due date rolled around, it was the end of April. Um, Hospital protocols were um very different. Like I think I think what ended up happening was I had a vision of what my labor and delivery would look like and kind of getting settled and moved into the house would look like. And everything kind of like got thrown out the window because
Mm.
the day of comes and they um they had actually sent me away. So I went to the hospital. I felt the contractions, they were pretty regularly happening. And they sent me away because they were trying to like keep it very limited and like not
Oh,
try to
wow.
have the most of the labor happening in the hospital. Like they wanted people to try to like stay in their homes as long as they could before actually admitting them. Um, so yeah, it was such a strange and bizarre time. And I remember, you know, I arrived at the hospital. I don't know this is TMI. This is my birth story. But
This is real life, right? That's what we're
this
doing here.
this is real. This literally happened. So it was like 5 a.m. We get to the
Okay.
hospital. They make me go up there. I have to have a mask. I'm like having contractions, trying to breathe, having the mask on. Husband's not allowed to come in yet because they're trying to like keep it limited. And they run the test and they check me and everything. And they're like, oh, you're not far along enough yet. Like you might have a few more days because this is your first pregnancy. And like they were a little bit skeptical that it would be happening that day. So they sent
Oh,
me
wow.
home.
Okay.
Husband was waiting in the car for me. And I was like, okay, like I'm in a lot of pain right now, but they said that this might be a couple more days. So So I
I
spent the
mean, how
next,
was that for you to like hear that? Like you're in significant amount of pain, and they go, "Oh, you might be doing this for a couple more days."
they were like, maybe a few more days, maybe a week. Like
Oh,
this, you're not far along enough for this to be happening today. And I was like, oh, I can't do this. Um, but you just make it work. You roll with the punches. It's like that's what you gotta do. So
hmm.
we went home and I proceeded to labor like at home for the next,
Okay.
I think maybe like 8 hours. And then by that time I was like, no, we have to go back. Like we really have to go back. So
Yeah.
we ended up driving like through rush hours the afternoon, rush hour in Southern California. And then by like 4 o'clock in that afternoon, they finally admitted me because they were like, "Oh, okay, you are far along. Like your husband can go ahead and come up." And I just remember thinking like it was so different because I wanted my family to be there. I had
Mm.
imagined that it would be like I would be able to do all the things that I had prepared for, like the birth ball and walking around and like being able to have my playlist. Like I made a playlist for like not that I could hear anything at that point, but
Yeah.
I
Fair.
was like these are all the things that they say you should prepare for. We had like the little go bag with all the stuff and everything, but
Hmm.
I was admitted and they were like, "No, you're ready. Like this, we're gonna get ready to start pushing. We'll go ahead and let your husband know that he can come up." And so I was admitted, husband comes up, they swab us both, they test us
Hmm.
for COVID. We all have to mask up. I'm like laboring with my mask. Part of my original birth plan was like I thought that I wanted an epidural, but they were like, nope, like this is happening now. So
Oh, what? So by
um
that point, it was too late.
by that point it was too late. And
Wow.
looking back,
Okay.
like I think that worked out the way it was supposed to. I was in a lot of pain, but it was super fast. So at least I wasn't in a lot of pain for long. So yeah, I think it was very much a snapshot of like the things to come, like picturing and imagining plans being a certain way, and then
Hmm.
having it look completely different and like not in a way that I could have ever imagined, like having to do deep breathing with like a N95 mask. Because at that point, like KN95s weren't really sold and like there were shortages on stuff. So
Okay.
we had like an old like an N95 mask that Kevin had for like woodworking or something like that. So like I
Oh,
had
wow.
that on and he had something else on and it was just like really, really like so strange to look back on. Um, but
Can I ask?
yeah, I think
I was just going to ask because I heard you mentioning, not necessarily being able to kind of go through with some of the things that maybe you had envisioned in your mind. And one of them I heard you mention kind of at the beginning there was that even like your birthing classes got canceled and you kind of missed out on being able to complete those. And I know I've heard from so many parents, kind of the biggest overwhelming thing is that they don't give us a parent manual on how to do these things. And the closest thing we get are some of those birthing classes for most of us folks that are doing it for the very first time. And so I'm super curious, like, what was your thought process? Was that scary to not then be able to kind of go to those classes that are supposed to kind of be there to help you and to kind of prepare you? Like, can you tell me more about that?
yeah, I think so. What they ended up doing was they made videos accessible for so
Okay.
instead of going to the instead of going to Kaiser for classes, they kind of sent links for videos that we could watch. But I
Okay.
think what I missed was being in the room with other parents and kind of seeing their questions and
Mm,
like feeling that sense of community as we're all doing this together.
yeah.
And I think um one thing that was kind of a theme throughout the first 2 to 3 years was this sense of isolation. Um, so the information was accessible, like you can look all of it up, and I would um, like read stuff online and try to like read the books that they provided us. They had like these little pamphlet book things that you could read, but I think the thing that I missed the most out of that was like the sense of I'm not going through this alone. And I
Mm.
think that was maybe one of the more traumatic pieces of not only having a baby during like at the beginning of the pandemic when everything was so uncertain, but also that feeling of like isolation because we're having to physically isolate from everyone else. Um,
Yeah.
so
Wow.
yeah.
And I appreciate you mentioning that. I heard you mention kind of it being a theme. I'd love to kind of hear more, like how did that end up playing a role kind of in the next steps? Because that pandemic, you're right at the beginning here, and we were in it for a good like 2 years, which is those big growing ages, right? As you're growing as a parent, you're growing this human being. I mean, that's a lot to kind of handle, and like you said, to have to do it in such isolation, I imagine that being incredibly difficult.
Yeah. And I think there was a whole like mix of feelings that were happening, right? Like being at home and having to work from home wasn't the worst. That meant more time spent with baby, and I was able to, like the breastfeeding aspect was easier than if I had to, go back to an office after maternity leave and have to figure out like a pumping schedule and things like that. Um, so there were definitely some unexpected pros of
Okay.
um, being able to be at home for that extended length of time. But the the feeling of disconnect, I think, was, not only physically were we having to isolate from everyone else, but I think the like anxiety that both my husband and I felt like kind of took it to this place of like, okay, we really can't meet up with anyone. And then it became really easy to also not intentionally reach out. And I
Mm.
think, I don't know, like maybe you could speak more to this, but in the beginning, as we're transitioning into parenthood and we're, up at all hours and we're like the messiest versions of ourselves at that point, like
Yeah.
it felt very much like I didn't want to talk to anyone at that time.
Mm.
Like it was so easy to not only physically isolate because we had to, but kind of emotionally and like socially disconnect from everyone. Because of the anxiety, because of the like the perfectionist not wanting others to see how messy things were and how scared we were and how anxious I was and how stressed out I was. Um, so I don't know. I definitely experienced postpartum anxiety, but also have like it was difficult to know like how much of this is normal, how much of this is because there's a pandemic happening.
Yeah.
So I tended to isolate myself, and I think that was one thing like looking back several years down the road at this point, I'm like, wow, like that was so easy to fall into that pattern.
Yeah.
Mm.
Can you tell me? I know you mentioned kind of the anxieties. Like for you, how did that end up kind of presenting? What did that look like?
Yeah. Oh man. I like look at some of the things and we know so much more about COVID now than we did back then, but I think it looked like, well, I think the other piece to mention that puts it a little more into context is that once we brought baby home, and we were doing like the day after checkup and the follow-ups and things like that. It turns out that he ended up having jaundice, and we needed to bring him back to be admitted um,
Wow.
in the NICU to do like
Was was
the
that
light
scary to hear
treatment.
that?
Hmm?
Was it scary to hear that for you as a parent, especially as a new parent?
It was like another unexpected thing of like, oh, his blood tests are showing that his like bilirubin levels are elevated, and what we're going to
Hmm.
try to do is we're going to try to do like a light blanket for him. And then they ended up saying like, oh, we need like a more intensive treatment for this jaundice because it's escalating more quickly. So having him admitted and doing like the light box treatment. So it's basically like you put your baby in a box and then there's like light. And then that
Yeah.
helps with that. Um, I think that the feeling of like, okay, things are okay because he's at home, things are good now. And then the unexpected of like, well, actually, you need to bring him back and he has to go through this treatment. And it's like
Gotcha.
a lot of a lot of babies, especially of East Asian descent, have jaundice. Um,
Hmm.
and it's really common. But at the time, it was like, you have to bring him back. There has to be only one parent that's allowed in. So you can't both go. And because of the COVID protocols and things like that, you have to wear a
Hmm.
mask the whole time. Um, and then like getting the hang of things, but also having that disruption, I think kind of worsened the anxiety of like, you can't let your guard down. So
Yeah.
after he was only in that treatment for like 24 hours, but which was very, quick, and I'm thankful for that. But I think what ended up happening was both me and my husband had anxiety about COVID, and we would do the things like we can't go outside without a mask. So if we want to take a walk, we have to have a mask on. We have to like Clorox our groceries. We have to
Yeah.
like make sure that any like no one can visit except for like maybe grandparents, and it's after they've like isolated a couple days to make sure they're not sick. So it was
Hmm.
extreme. It was extreme at that time, and I think that's how our anxiety manifested.
Gotcha. And I imagine to kind of, because I hear you mentioning, this is your experience and it is hard, especially when you're kind of locked down and isolated, to know like how much of this is just kind of expected with new parents and kind of some of those anxieties, how much of it, like you said, is related or even exacerbated by postpartum. And then on top of it, like you said, now there's also this, tons of news about what's happening with the pandemic, that you're just kind of layering all of these um, factors that could be, triggers for the onset of these high anxiety symptoms. And we're just kind of perfect storming them around you and your family, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, it was so many layers at that time. And I remember the toll it took on my husband and I, like our interactions, because both of us were so on edge about everything at that time that it became we fell into a pattern of like, oh, are you doing enough? Are you doing enough? And that felt very much like, okay, now we're at odds because both of us are trying to get the other one to do more and constantly feeling like we're against each other rather than working together. It became
Yeah.
very easy to fall into that pattern, especially like in that first year, sleep deprived, adjusting, and trying to like work on top of that. So it was definitely a perfect storm, like you're saying, of like so much, so much stress and anxiety, but also like trying to celebrate the fact that, that our family has expanded. We're creating a life
Yeah.
together um and all these things. And I think, that adds in another layer of like guilt. Like, why can't I be happy that like we have a baby, we have a house. Like these are all the things that we have said we've always wanted. So why does it feel so stressful? Um,
Mm.
yeah.
When you say when you say guilt, like was it guilt that you were having those feelings? Or can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I think, can you hang on? I'm not sure if you can hear my kiddo in the background.
Hey, kid, I'm talking to parents. Noises of kids in the background is kind of a
Okay, is that
normal
okay?
thing, so we're good. We're totally fine.
Okay.
Again,
Um,
real life folks.
you know what? Real talk, I bribed him with candy. I was like, if you can put on a movie with grandma and be like nice and calm for the next hour, I will give you candy. I will give you gum. Like gum is a real treat right now. So,
Right? You got to find something that gets their buy-in. Absolutely.
but anyways, um, wanted to make sure that was okay. He won't come in, but I think he's having fun out like right outside the door now. Um, but yeah, going back to the feeling of guilt that kind of happens, I think, um, and again, this was my experience. There was a guilt of like, I'm not doing enough. I'm not
Mm,
happy enough. This is what I've always wanted. So why doesn't it feel easier? Um,
yeah.
like I'm a therapist. I should know how to make myself feel happier, or I should know
Mm,
the things that I have to do in order to make my relationship with my husband more harmonious. Like all of these pressures, all of these things that I put on myself, especially that first year of
yeah.
like you're not doing enough, you're not enough, and then that guilt of um kind of feeling all of those things um
Hmm.
made it yeah, it made it I like super stressful at that time. So not only were there like, these environmental things that are out of our control that are happening, um, but kind of that first year of all of those things happening all at the same time.
And I think, sorry for the sizzling and crackling. I'm adding my rice right now. So
I'm like,
I'm
oh,
on to
the rice is going
rice.
in. It's looking
Yeah.
good.
um, but you mentioned kind of this guilt, this idea of I'm not doing enough. It needs, I ought to be able to kind of manage these things or know how to handle them. And I think what you're saying, like for me, I know resonates. I know I've heard it from dozens of parents that there's whether it's coming from societal pressures, our own kind of internal pressures, that there is kind of this narrative that I feel like are really good at kind of going, I need to fit into this. And this is what
Mhm.
I should, that word should. I mean, I feel like it's such a common thing that you hear. And so then there's all these added like, well, it doesn't look like that, so then it must be something on my end. I must not be, like you said, good enough or failing in
What's
some way,
wrong
shape,
with
or form.
me? Hmm.
Yes. And I mean, gosh, to kind of have that feeling,
Hmm.
I can imagine feels just only intensifies kind of that, like you said, that want to isolate, because why would we want to kind of expose ourselves, like, expose other people to seeing that, look, I'm failing.
Yeah, um I think that's so spot on of like when we struggle, it's it's societal pressure tells us that we shouldn't be struggling. Like there's all these things that we need to be doing and we need to make it look easy. And sharing that struggle makes you look weak. So I think that like so contributed to that first year of like I can't talk to anyone else about the things that I'm going through, or the struggles that I have with this parenthood transition. Like on the outside, everything should be good. Like everything should be super happy and celebratory. Um, but the the like pressure to be perfect really conflicted with wanting to share that with others. And then that made it worse, right? Like my wanting to not share how hard that was exacerbated that feeling of anxiety and I'm alone and like I'm the only one who's feeling this way. I'm the only one who can't handle what this whole chapter has looked like so far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like you said, kind of handle something that I signed up for, right? That, hey, this was something that I wanted. And, here I'm kind of saying I can't handle that. And gosh, like you said, it's such a narrative that for whatever reason us parents are so good at kind of like you said falling into that and having that be so much of what's kind of dictating some of those actions in our life.
Um, yeah, it's and I think social media, at least the social media I was on at that time. So I wanted to follow other parents for like tips and tricks and like how to do things, but man, that was not a good idea for me at that time because it's like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm not doing that and I'm not doing that. And like, oh, what's gentle parenting? Is that like, is that another name for authoritative or authoritarian parenting? Like all these things that like were coming up and like as a parent, you should be doing this. And as a like these are things you need to do with an infant or newborn to like stimulate their like cognitive development and their physical development. It's all about the milestones. Um, so much worry about milestones at that time. Like there's
Yeah.
there's such a like there's such a culture, I think, around millennial parenting, I think. And
Okay.
I at that time it was the information was helpful, but the overload of information probably backfired. And it wasn't until I started seeing more things about like parents being vulnerable or finding humor in the mess and chaos that was a little bit more validating of the
Okay.
experience that I was going through. But that didn't come until later because I wasn't looking for that at that time.
Yeah. And I was just about to ask, like, how did you end up working through that and kind of getting to the other side of that? Even for, I know you mentioned kind of in your relationship that there were definitely those added stressors that were taking a toll on the relationship. And so I'm so curious, like what was your journey of being able to get to that other side and be
Mm,
able to recognize, like you said, hey, these social medias, although the intention behind following them, right, was there and it was honorable, that maybe they weren't kind of what you needed at that moment in time, and it was maybe doing a little bit more harm.
yeah. I think my a turning point for us was, you know, we had several conversations about getting on the same page with how we were parenting and what that looked like. And, you know, full transparency, it was a struggle for like the first 2 to 3 years. I think our turning point happened when right around when he turned 3, because he was a little bit
Okay.
more independent. And I think we were sleeping more by that point. Like sleep makes such a huge difference. But also the timing of um what was being learned about COVID was kind of around that point where, like,
Okay.
okay, there's a vaccine that's available to kids 6 and under. And I
Mm-hmm.
think as more information came out about COVID and things were kind of like lightening up and we were taking small steps to get out of our comfort zone as far as like going out and spending more time around other people and crowds and kind of almost that exposure therapy of like making small incremental steps and knowing that it was okay. Like things would be okay even if we caught germs or got sick or things like that. Um,
Yeah.
I think I think it wasn't until both of us got on the same page about like we are not each other's enemy. We can work together, and this is the solution that we're uniting towards. It's so cliche. Like they always say that, right? Like you and your spouse are not like you're not at odds. Like you have to focus as a team. But that really it didn't as much as we'd heard that, it didn't really click until
Yeah.
we were able to come together. And I think also the value of taking breaks and scheduling vacations and really like having time for fun. It wasn't until we focused on that a bit more that things got a little bit more lighthearted so that it balanced out the heaviness that we had experienced for the first 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I love about what you just said is that, taking the breaks, right? And the importance of that because there's so much, and this is something for any folks listening who've listened to me long enough or who have ever worked with me, I probably say it so much, so you're probably sick of it, but I'm going to say it again. Is that that idea that don't go to bed angry, right? When it comes to your partner. I disagree with that so much. And it's because that idea of, we just need to power through this and, just
Yeah.
I feel like the intention of just making sure that you're making repairs. I totally appreciate the intention, but that idea of we have to do it and we have to do it now, and this is what it needs to look like. Again, every relationship, I think, as you're mentioning, is different, and it requires sometimes those pauses in order for you to be able to come back to it in a more helpful, more productive way where you can, like you said, maybe have a little bit of that logic, that rationality come back online and remember, like, this is my teammate, this is my partner, this is it my my enemy.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I used to be one of those people that would say, like, we got to talk through it. Like, we have
Yeah.
to figure this out. It has to be now. I can't handle sitting in this ambiguity and like limbo state. So we got to talk about it now. And that, like, that was so unproductive. We would talk, like, my husband would, bless his heart, he would begrudgingly talk through this thing with me for like 2 to 3 hours, and we'd not like get anywhere because both of us were
Yes.
too tired. Both of us were too like emotionally amped to really
Mm-hmm.
like come to a solution. So I am no longer, I have seen the error of my ways. I am no longer like, we gotta talk through this right now. Some things some things you can prioritize, some things can wait. Oftentimes, oftentimes it can wait. Like there's usually nothing so pressing that you need to talk about it when you're like in a heightened state. Um,
Yeah.
and I think since giving both of us more time to settle before we actually like come back together to talk something out, it's been a game changer. So
Yeah.
yeah, your
Absolutely.
advice is very, very sound.
Well, and here's the deal. I can absolutely relate to what you just mentioned because I so although I'm the person that likes to take breaks, my spouse on the other hand does very much, and kind of when we first started was that I want to talk it out. He's very much an external processor. I'm an internal processor. And so that was definitely a point of contention for many years of our marriage. And, we've been married quite some time now, but we had to learn just that. Like, it wasn't something that I was ever taught. That's not something that was like, just, oh, I woke up one day and I had that knowledge of very much like you said, of figuring out kind of what works for us. And for me, similar to like what you're saying, I need that pause to be able to like figure out my thoughts, because if I kept talking, it was one going to be nonsense and also probably come out super hurtful, which was not my intention at all.
I think um like for my spouse and I, we had not encountered the level of conflict that we did until we became new parents that were sleep deprived and like kind of out of our minds for a little bit. But now I feel like having gone through that experience and overcoming it and kind of like being on the other side of it,
Hmm.
there is so much more closeness, I think, because we've shown each other like we've seen each other at our worst and we're still here. Like we still made it. We're not perfect people, but we still
Yeah.
accept each other unconditionally. And I don't I at the time when we were in it, I couldn't there was like no way I could have seen the end in sight and like what the positive of that situation was going to be. But I think there's something kind of reassuring of like going through something like that and still being sticking around to kind of give you that confidence of like, all right, you've seen me at my worst and you're still here. So I guess there's something here.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard you mention kind of not not really being able to see it when you're in the thick of it. When you were in the thick of it, did that compound any of that feelings of loneliness or isolation that you were already kind of feeling just with all of your perfect storm?
For sure, because you're going through this this huge transition. You don't know if anyone else has ever felt the exact thing that you're going through. And on top of that, the like your person um, you're at odds with. And for us, we hadn't like sure we'd had conflict before um and like worked through different confrontations and arguments and things like that. But I felt like it was a whole nother level at that time because um, here's your person that you're supposed to be so aligned with, so attuned to, and it's almost like you're speaking different languages.
Yeah.
And um, and that definitely led to more like of that guilt shame that we were talking about of like, okay, not only do I not know what I'm doing as a parent, but now I am kind of losing track of this thing that I thought was like steady, consistent, like we're good. Um,
Hmm.
and I think I think now looking back at it, it's not that we were ever not good, but I think we needed to go through that to show ourselves that like we can overcome things, we have resiliency, we can recover. And just because we are in conflict doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. And that was like huge for me because
Mm.
I'm such a like non-confrontational, conflict avoidant person. It felt like okay, I guess it's the end. I guess we're over because we're having this like so much conflict. But I think that was important for a conflict avoidant person like me to see that actually conflict can be a strengthening tool in your
Yeah.
relationship, which I never thought that I would be able to say. I spent so much time trying to like keep the peace and like
Hmm.
just in life in general. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, that was a very interesting insight that happened as a result of going through that.
And I think that's perfect because I wanted to ask like what I've been asking most of my parents, that if you were able to get into a time machine and kind of go back and give yourself some thoughts or some preparations, um, even for those folks that are having a newer family right now as we speak, kind of what would you have told yourself? What would you have wanted to hear, or would have been helpful to hear?
I think I would have told told me like going back into 3 to 4 years ago, this is temporary
Mm.
and it's okay to be messy. It's okay to be imperfect. Like no one gets it perfectly right. And like no one talks about not getting it perfectly right. And and I, I say this now to a lot of my clients, like you have to have self-compassion, you have to have grace, you have to have grace for your partner. Um,
Mm.
but repeating that over and over again, like it's okay. Like the things you're doing are enough. The things the ways that you will continue to grow will get there. And the first, the first year is always going to be, it's always going to be difficult. Like I don't know, maybe that's not true for everyone, but I think most people, it's not going to look exactly the way that you pictured it would.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, the temporary nature of it, things will get better, just give it time. And I think have some patience because I think there was so much pressure, like we were talking about, to like get it right and get it right the first time.
Hmm.
Um, so so yeah, I think self-compassion and grace were things that I very easily tell other people to do for themselves, but kind of internalizing that for me at that time was, I didn't realize that I wasn't doing that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And isn't that the thing? I feel like I hear everyone say, I'm really good at telling others,
for sure.
like you said, kind of how to have that grace or things you could do to offer yourself some more compassion. But it's really, really hard to kind of
Yeah.
look in that mirror and tell it to the person that you see in there.
Yes, absolutely. Um, it's funny. One of the things that we stumbled upon later I had, that I wish that I had paid more attention to, and this is going to sound so silly. The TV show Bluey was game changer for me because that show is so much for the parents as well. And there's this episode where the mom is like super hard on herself, and then it takes another mom telling her that she's doing great. That really
Mm.
like helps her to have some more self-compassion. So I think about that episode a lot of like, yes, we all need a mom friend or like another peer or support
Hmm.
that just tells us and encourages us that we're doing okay, like it's going to be okay. Um,
Yeah.
and I think I think if I had isolated less, then I probably would have received that a bit more in the
Mm.
early stages. Um,
Yeah.
mm.
You know what's I laugh only because I have heard Bluey being recommended by so many parents. And my kids were too old. We didn't have Bluey back then. So I was never exposed to it, but you are not the first person. And I think that that's so awesome. So shout out to Bluey for apparently, doing some things that are super helpful in your content. Yeah, that's awesome.
Bluey was very therapeutic at that time, on top of like actual therapy. Like that's the other thing is
Yeah.
obviously we are huge proponents of therapy. I think individual therapy for me was very helpful, and couples therapy for us
Mm.
helped us immensely, like getting back, reminding us to be a team, to appreciate
Yeah.
each other, that we are not each other's enemy. Um,
Hmm.
so, so yeah, therapy, patience, self-compassion, Bluey, like,
Well, I love all those resources that you did share that you found kind of really useful in your journey. And I know that we've only scratched the surface of some of your journey. So I'm sure I will be tapping you again and asking you to come back and talk to me some more.
I'd love
Um,
to.
but in the meantime, here's my fried rice. Hopefully, I did you proud.
Oh,
Um,
looks delicious.
I'm so
Amazing.
excited to try it. And, it's got the spam in it. I did do the spam this time because we are very much a pro spam in this house.
I love spam. Can't go wrong.
When I saw that on the
Controversial hot
recipe, I was
take.
like, oh, yeah,
Controversial.
yeah. Like, I've got that in my pantry because we buy it by the bulk. So I love it. And I just wanted to say again, thank you so much, one, for being willing to share this recipe with us, but also to share your story and kind of some of the challenges that you have encountered, especially trying to navigate all of this through a pandemic, which not everybody can say they've done. You know, it's a very unique thing about your journey. However, at the same time, there were dozens and hundreds of babies that were also born around the same time, and I imagine kind of, you know, maybe a piece of it go, oh yeah, that sounds really familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. It was such a unique time. And I think for our family, now I can say that the timing was perfect for us.
Hmm.
We went through a lot of struggles and we went through a lot of challenges, but I think we are the family we are today because of that experience. And if anyone is in the thick of it, that's going to be hard to really believe. But
Yes.
um, but like speaking from someone who has been in that situation of like this is hard and I don't know how it's going to get better,
Hmm.
it will.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sarina, for joining us today. I do appreciate it. And
Yes.
we'll see you next time and see everyone else. Thanks for joining us and listening in today. If you or anyone that you know is struggling with any of the topics that we discussed in today's episode, make sure to check out our show notes for support and resources. You can get help. Thanks again for joining us on today's episode of The Real Family Eats. If you're a parent ready to share your real life parenting story, make sure to reach out to us in our website found in the show notes. And that goes for today's recipe, social medias, support, and resources. All of that can be found in our show notes. So make sure to check them out. And make sure to follow, like, share, subscribe, and stay up to date on all things The Real Family Eats. I hope you'll join us next time for more food for thought and thoughtful food. Enjoy your eats.